That sound okay? Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking around for the last talk of the day and the several days. We're going to talk about chloride management planning, a case study from Starkweather Creek watershed in the Madison area. Okay, so Allison touched on this a little bit, but basically this is a great graphic from Minnesota Pollution Control Agency on the trouble with too much salt, road salt, water softeners, fertilizer, manure, dust suppressants, main sources we kind of talked about. It's bad for aquatic life and drinking water. Quick summary. So in Wisconsin, chronic toxicity level is 395 milligrams per liter. Acute toxicity level is 757 milligrams per liter. Chronic is more of a long-term exposure over 4 consecutive days, where acute can be a single short-term exposure that happens 2 or more times in a 3-year period. So in Wisconsin, currently we have over 40 water bodies that are listed as impaired for chloride. So on the 303D list, you can see where they are scattered around the state. So many of them are in the southeastern part of the state. In our region, which is Dane County, we have 4. So in Dane County, it is Starkweather Creek, the subject of our study. Pheasant Branch Creek, which is on the west side going through Middleton. Odana Pond, which is a little golf course pond there circled on the map. And then Yahara River, the upper stretch of the Yahara River, which was actually delisted in this latest listing. But there is some question, I think, whether that's because things actually have improved or if there was some issue and it shouldn't have really been listed in the first place. So our study focused on Starkweather Creek. It's a very large watershed in the Madison area, almost 16,000 acres, primarily urban land use on the northeast side of the city of Madison. And it was listed for chloride impairment in 2016. So 7 years ago now at this point. So we decided to work with some of the key stakeholders in the area and develop a chloride management plan for the Starkweather Creek watershed. The concept was we could work with Saltwise to kind of demonstrate the effectiveness, hopefully, of the Saltwise practices, education, and training if we kind of focus these efforts in a single watershed. So the scope of the plan was to identify likely salt sources in Starkweather Creek, implement best management practices to reduce salt use in the watershed, and then through monitoring, we could track whether we were actually making an improvement. So it was set up to be basically a 4 or 5 year plan. So we started work on the plan in 2020. We're now in 2023. Then after 2024 to 25, we'll do like a post assessment to see how things are going. So we were fortunate to have a great steering committee for this work. The role of the steering committee was to kind of help guide development of the plan. It was people that were knowledgeable in salt use practices and reduction efforts, knowledge of the watershed itself, also early adopters of Saltwise practices and key implementation partners. So we had the Sewers District, Friends of Starkweather Creek, which is a local watershed group, City of Madison, Engineering, Phil Gabler, who was at the earlier talk, was on our steering committee for this. Public Health, Dane County and City of Madison, who have done chloride monitoring in the area for quite some time. Saltwise, of course, Allison, DNR stormwater staff, and then importantly, American Family Insurance, who's not only located in the watershed, but also has been an early adopter of Saltwise practices, as well as the Bruce Company, who is a commercial winter maintenance company, as well as landscape company that, again, has been an early adopter of Saltwise practices. So the plan development had basically 3 main components. One was to do a GIS analysis of the watershed to sort of help us identify most likely sources of chlorides of salt. A volunteer monitoring component to kind of see how things are changing. And then, of course, the community engagement, the Saltwise education was a big part of what we were trying to do. So in the GIS analysis, we broke Starkweather Creek into basically 3 sub-watersheds. So there's a west branch, that's this area, and then an east branch, that's this area, and then there's sort of a main branch where they come together for a little way before they enter Lake Monona. So you can see it in most of these areas that the non-residential and so commercial properties and multifamily properties made up the largest, this is percent imperviousness of the watershed. So likely sources of salt, right? Sidewalks, driveways, streets, basically. So we didn't include rooftops in here, but we included parking lots, sidewalks, driveways, and streets. So single family driveways and sidewalks, relatively small percentage. County salt routes, small percentage in comparison, as well as city salt routes, small percentage in comparison. So just in this basic like land use analysis was telling us that at least in this watershed, we should probably focus on commercial multifamily properties. So digging a little deeper into some of that, we really looked at the city salt routes, and City of Madison has gotten, I think, progressively pretty good at reducing the amount of salt they use. They've gone through the salt wise training. They have their drivers go through the workshops and get trained. So, you know, as far as salt routes go, basically 30% of the county streets in this, or county roads in this watershed, and 30% of the city streets in this watershed are salt routes. So those are basically the main thoroughfares, the main collectors, bus routes, areas around schools, fire stations, police stations, hospitals, and major hills and curbs. So that's what the city focuses on salting, and they don't salt the rest. So there's 40% of the streets in the watershed then that aren't really salted. They're sanded with a mixture of a little bit of salt in it. Okay. Just make sure I didn't advance too far. Okay, so what this told us was, again, the real opportunity here as far as salt reduction is where it's being used the most, which this is East Town Mall. It's a big commercial shopping area in the watershed on the East Branch. So according to the data we had, and this kind of varies a little bit, but we figured about 30% of the companies working as private applicators, the ones that tend to do commercial parking lots and driveways, only 30% have gone through the applicator training. So it leaves a large group of private applicators to be trained yet, as well as the fact that that's obviously constantly changing. A lot of these are not big commercial businesses like Bruce Company, but small 1 or 2 person crews that some use it, you know, you get new ones some years, some use drop off. So again, that's a big opportunity. And also within East Town Mall and the East Branch subwatershed, the 20 largest parking lots totaled almost 30% of that non-residential and multifamily area, 174 acres. So there's a potential to focus on, make a lot of impact by focusing on just a few of the really largest parking lots. So we started the project then kind of with the monitoring in the fall of 2020. We had about a dozen monitor volunteers. We were doing 4 sites at that time, 2 on the East Branch and 2 on the West Branch. Initially, when we started monitoring, people were doing conductivity measurements, as well as doing the chloride titrator strips, the Quantabs, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And then if we got a high level that was above the chronic toxicity level or near it, we would also take a grab sample and send that into the lab. So we were doing weekly monitoring in the winter, or whenever there was a salting event or a melting event, we would go out there too. So you can see, for, you know, as I mentioned, we had 2 on the West Branch, 2 on the East Branch during our first round of monitoring. And you can see that, you know, we had some hits here where it got, this is for one of the sites, Fair Oaks, which is over here, that we had some getting above that chronic toxicity level, but for the most part was below that level at this site. But you see, like Allison mentioned, you know, there's a high kind of base flow level even in the summertime, but we know it's gotten in the groundwater at this point, around 100 milligrams per liter. This is another site. This is now the Ivy Street station. So that's over here on the East Branch. So in comparison, each branch has been much higher levels, some above the acute toxicity level. Again, especially in this like in the February of 21, we had a big melt event. And those are when we really get the big spikes here during those like late winter, early spring melt events. Tends to be the big times of chloride loading. So a few key findings here. So we learned a lot from that first season of monitoring and decided to make some changes. A couple of our observations, chlorides were consistently higher in the east branch compared to the west branch. Again, that's where the shopping center was. That becomes the focus of our study. Baseline chloride levels in the non-winter months indicate groundwater contamination. I mentioned that. Highest chloride levels during the spring melt events. And then we also realized that the Quantab chloride test strips were actually very easy to use. They correlated well to the lab results and were much better than the conductivity meters, which you can't really get an indication of what the chloride level is right away. Right? It's a more complicated relationship. So moving forward then in our monitoring, we decided to go strictly to the Quantab strips. And by doing that, we were able to expand the number of volunteers that we had and expand the number of sites we were monitoring. It was much simpler, easy to use. So we still take the grab sample if it is a high level so that we have that sort of lab verification value, but we're primarily using the Quantab strips. And we have seen there's a really pretty good correlation between the test strips and the lab values. The R-squared value for those that like statistics has been like above 0.9. So pretty good correlation between the two. So now what we were able to do now with this sort of new focus just on the tab monitoring is really expand the monitoring to more sites. Again, primarily focus more on the East Branch because we think that's our main problem area. And we've also changed the way that we monitor it a little bit. So before we had a different volunteer for each site. So they would maybe go out on different days. So we couldn't necessarily correlate what's happening as it flows through the system. Now we have same volunteer that will do like, this group of sites at the same time. So we've been able to sort of really try to narrow in the focus of where are these changes happening because they're being monitored at roughly the same date and close to the same time. So the idea of this was to use the monitoring to actually try to help narrow down the focus of where are these problem areas and help identify them. So that's kind of what we did here. I have a comparison of Zaire Road and then Sycamore. And you can see Zaire Road, which is kind of upstream of the mall area here, relatively lower compared to what we're getting at Sycamore, which is just down here downstream of the mall area. Again, another indication that one of our big problem sources is this commercial shopping center area in the watershed. So boots on the ground, people out in the field is a great way to identify problems, right? These are actual pictures that I took from being out there doing monitoring and seeing what's going on. This is not meet the criteria for salt storage. And fortunately, in Madison, Public Health Department does have the authority to contact people and issue citations. And they were able to work with the applicator here and get this cleaned up. So, this is kind of, I think, pretty good indication of the type of things that are happening in the watershed that through this kind of focused monitoring, we knew sort of where to look because we knew where concentrations were getting higher and what storm sewer outfalls kind of, came in from those general areas. So we're able to sort of track down an area to take a closer look at compared to trying to investigate the whole watershed, right? So we were able to get this cleaned up. There's actually, this is wetlands back here and Starkweather Creek is kind of back through this area. So another big component of the study was a watershed survey. So it was an online survey, basically trying to gauge the level of knowledge and attitudes about salt and create a baseline so we can see our education efforts having an effect. So we'll follow this study up, 24, 25 to kind of see how things compare. But for this study, so we surveyed There are about 50,000, 51,000 people in the watershed. We got 87 responses, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's actually gives you a confidence interval of plus or minus 10%. So pretty good for the size of that population. Pretty good. We looked at what neighborhood people were in, and we got fairly good representation. But just a few things I wanted to kind of highlight from that. So we asked people, you know, what do you see generally in your neighborhood? You know, this is actually the right amount of salt that people should be putting down compared to these other images. And for the most part, people thought they were seeing this. But if, you know, almost 23% saw a lot of this in their watershed too. And even 7% seeing this kind of stuff out there, as you could see from the other pictures I showed. Other questions we asked were, you know, where is de-icer typically used at your residence? So most people are only salting their sidewalk and walkways, which is a good thing, right? They're not salting their entire driveways. Some people are, but not the majority. What kind of product is used? So again, kind of the majority of people use things that they got free from the city of Madison. So city of Madison actually provides a mixture, that mixture of sand and salt free to their residents. You're in a community and you want to encourage people to use a mixture of sand and salt, provide it free to them. That's what they'll tend to use. Another question from the watershed survey, I'd say most people agreed or strongly agreed that reducing salt would improve the chloride water quality in Starkweather Creek. So people are aware of the problem. Also, most people said they already use only the amount of salt necessary or were very willing to do so. So again, you know, this, again, kind of, I think, an indication that we felt things were in pretty good shape on the residential side of things, not a huge potential problem, always room for improvement, but kind of another indication that the focus for us should be on the commercial properties. Then we also kind of asked, you know, with the public education idea, how do you prefer to get information about reducing salt use? And most people said, you know, social media was pretty high, email, websites were pretty high, newsletters pretty high, but not a lot of people want to come to workshops. Not many people reading the newspaper anymore, those kind of things. So we thought this was helpful for us sort of deciding how to focus our public information. So part of that community engagement, social media then was a big one. We're obviously working with SaltWise. Allison talked a lot about that, so I won't go into this too much, but there was a lot of information put out there that way. Because we were trying to focus on property owners in the commercial areas, we did work with city engineering and send out a letter. We'll say, I don't think this was very effective. A lot of the commercial mall businesses are owned by out-of-state companies, and it's hard to get contact of people, and I don't think this really did much for us. So we're still trying to figure that out. We had a couple of festivals that Allison had a booth on for community engagement. Again, now this is a big thing. There's a pilot in Dane County, and the city has a pilot because of their new ordinance where people can actually report it when they see oversalting, and somebody will outreach to them to try to provide some education. It's education first, but that's new. That's just started this past year. Hopefully that will start making a difference. And then kind of going forward, you know, we're focusing on the community engagement piece, especially thinking about how can we reach those commercial properties that are our focus area. So we're talking about having a program where we get some Badger volunteers from Friends of Starkweather Creek actually go to the businesses and talk to people and share information and literature. Also talking about working with the water utility to get some bill inserts that would at least go out. So I think the more times we can get this information out, the better. Expanding our chloride monitoring, especially using Quantab strips. And then, like I mentioned, we'll do a follow-up survey probably in 2024 or 2025 to see if we can measure some differences. So I just want to say the plan is available on our website. Anybody wants to read it in more detail than what I gave today. We also have a great feature. All the monitoring results are up on the website. We use Survey 123 for ArcGIS. So volunteers can actually on their smartphone enter the data as they're collecting it, and it'll populate in real time on the graphs on the website. So kind of real-time results as people enter the information, which I think is pretty cool. Again, plans on the website. If you want more information or see the data, here's a QR code or the short link to it. But again, just want to acknowledge the steering committee. This was funded in part by a DNR River Planning Grant in 2020. Steering committee and the implementation partners have been a big part of this project, and really thank everyone. So if you want to get involved, some of this Allison mentioned too, educate yourself about saltwise practices, help spread the word through your community and local watershed groups. In our area, at least, you can now report over salting, and you can also conduct your own chloride monitoring. As was mentioned, Rock River Coalition is working with us now to expand that through at least the Yahara watershed and eventually Rock River watershed, hopefully. So thank you, and Alice and I can take any questions you might have.
So, how long has Madison been supplying sand for free, sand and salt mixture, and has that made any kind of measurable impact?
That is a good question. I've been a resident there for 15 years now, and I think it's been available that full time that I've been there, at least. I don't know if you know where it goes, but yeah, it's been a long time.
That graph that you showed that the monitors could input their data real time was pretty effective. Was that difficult to set up, and how did you do that?
So we used Survey 123, which is part of ArcGIS. And so the graph that is reported is also part of that same software system. So it works really well together. It wasn't too difficult to set up at all. Did the county do that, or did you? We did that. Our GIS staff helped us with that.
If I can steal
yeah.
Mike's
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
okay. The free test strips that are available through the Isaac Walton League, they also have a map. I mean, it's not to the same level as what CARP-C's got going on, but that's also available online. So if there are citizen monitors who are out there, they will see that information, and that's nationwide.
I work for Vilas County. I'm going to out them here right now. So I've been talking to our maintenance department who does the salting, and they're very aware that they are putting too much salt down, but the human resources, the sheriff's department, they want more salt on the ground. So what message can I take to them? Do you have any kind of resources that I can take to them to get them to back off?
So resources more to get to people who are not on the front line but need like the general information. Yeah, I would say like on our website, we've got like under like outreach tools, or some of our videos are linked on that. Otherwise, on our YouTube channel, we've got like a few kind of just like a short couple minute or 5-minute overviews. Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, so right now we have a bill in the state legislature. It's modeled after a law that's been on the books in New Hampshire for about 10 years that provides limited liability protection to people that get certified in best practices. So if they get certified and then they keep records on what they've done, that they would not be held liable. They've done their due diligence. I think there's still, it has not been passed. No, we had a core group of people that testified to the state legislature, the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy, the Assembly Committee on Regulatory Licensing Reform just last month. And so right now it's kind of in committee. We need to wait for the next executive session, and then they could decide to push that to the floor. I mean, I think the fear can always be there, even with this. Even in New Hampshire, there've still been some lawsuits. But people have been, found not liable, right? I think the biggest message that I try to promote is we're not saying make your sidewalks unsafe, right? We're just saying learn kind of what you need to use, right? I mean, if you go in, I don't know if this is the analogy that came up, you go into a bathroom, I mean, it can be clean or it can like reek of Lysol, right? Like how much salt needs to go down for people to be safe, right? So it's about using best practices, knowing what those are. It's not about reducing the safety or increasing your liability. So we've actually seen some people use those best practices and saying they're getting better pavement conditions faster through the use of brine, and just people that are actually trained, right, on what they need to do. And there was a lawsuit I heard of in Wisconsin a couple of years ago where somebody slipped on excess salt on the pavement and fell.
Oh, wait, sorry. Yeah, we have a question from our online audience. You had mentioned capturing the brine waste from water softeners, and this person is wondering, how can we learn more about what's happening with that?
Yeah, so we actually have a couple online resources. Mike Gresh, who is pictured on the photos that I had on the slides, we've got a video. He worked for the Lucky Apartments in downtown Madison, and just it's kind of like a few minute like overview of that work. There's also a 1 hour in-depth webinar with the USDA Forest Products Lab discussing their brine reclamation setup. And we're going to have an event October 5th at the USDA Forest Products Lab with a smart salting class, and then afterwards have a tour of their facility so people can actually see that brine reclaim. So brine reclamation means that you're grabbing that chloride that would otherwise go down the drain and into our water, and you're also grabbing the hardness, right, that you've tried to pull out of the water. So that's going to be magnesium and calcium ions. So you get magnesium and calcium chloride, which is effective at lower temperatures. I mean, there's still chlorides, and magnesium and calcium chloride can do some more damage. They can be more corrosive, but you're reducing salt that would have otherwise gone down in addition to this material making its way into our fresh water. So it's still a net savings. We don't necessarily want our highway departments to start using, magnesium and calcium chloride instead of sodium chloride though.
If anybody's interested in the Isaac Walton League program, I'd be happy to stick around and talk to you about it. I am the local chapter president here in Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Division Vice President. So if you want to get in touch with our Salt Watch program, I will help you with that. The other thing is the bill that's currently in session. I've talked to a couple legislators. The one thing that I find troubling with it is even though they go through certified best management practices, there's nothing in the bill that gives a monitoring or a follow-up component to make sure that they are, even though they're getting that little limited liability.
Yep, we do not currently have enough kind of staff power, right, to go out and check on everybody. It's on them to do the record keeping. And the idea is I think it's just in general, we're raising the bar a step, right? Is it where we want it to be? No, but it would be a huge step still.
One of our online audience members was asking about what impact the Dane County Airport has, maybe on Starkweather Creek, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, the monitoring data showed us that the west branch is actually in pretty good shape, and we haven't seen a lot of exceedances there. And, we researched into a little bit and talked to the airport folks, and they actually have an airport sustainability plan. And as part of that, they did make some efforts to really reduce the amount of salt they use on things like the airport runways. They can't use salt because of planes, so they use other materials. So yeah, in our mind, again, the east branch is really the problem area, and especially the commercial shopping district. But yeah, I can see how people would think, oh, what about the airport? But doesn't prove to be the case, at least in our watershed.
Yeah, I would expand that to say airports are not using salt on their runways, right? Salt is extremely corrosive and our planes would be rusting out. So instead they use chloride alternatives like CMA, which is calcium magnesium acetate. There are different formate products as well. So these are not necessarily a silver bullet, right? If anything is organic, if it can be broken down and that gets into our water, it can be broken down in the water. Microbes are eating it. That's what breaks it down. They draw oxygen out of the water. So that said, if it doesn't go straight into our water, it is a win. So CMA, potassium formate are products. You might see Entry is the name of one of the commercial options. It's a chloride-free de-icer that's on the market. There are others. So airports are some of the first folks to say, yeah, we're not going to use salt. It's damaging our infrastructure. It's damaging these planes. Although they do use it on the sidewalks, but the majority of the pavement, the runways, they're not using salt. And that would be true of other airports as well.
You mentioned briefly that the kind of reporting tool was associated with some sort of ordinance that was passed in the Madison area. Can you elaborate a little bit on that ordinance?
Oh, okay. I've got the mic. I'm going to steal it back. Okay. So yeah, the city of Madison passed an ordinance this last year that said if there is extra salt, excess salt, so again, it's beyond what's making people safe, that's left on your sidewalks, public sidewalks, you need to sweep it up because that's a pollutant and it's headed into our water. So get rid of it and not just like dump it, you know, like sweep it up. Problem is there are a lot of problems with this, right? Like, yeah, you sweep up the salt. Now what do you do with it, right? You put it in landfill. It ends up in landfill leachate. That ends up in our streams because the wastewater treatment plant cannot clean it. So it's still a step forward. This last year, it was all education. So no one actually got fined, but it was on the building inspectors to go out and talk to those property owners if there was a complaint about excess salt. The Dane County wide spot over salting was led up by a county staff who had a lot of things on her plate. So she did her best to reach out. I tried to support that a little bit as well. But again, it's more education at this point, because in general, people put salt down because they're trying to do a good thing, right? They're trying to make sure people are safe. So try not to be punitive about that.
If delisting may be a little wonky or sometimes infeasible, and again, maybe water bodies taken off that list, maybe shouldn't have been on them in the first place, what do you feel like are appropriate mechanisms for managing the chloride that's already in our systems, even if we were to, you know, completely get this chloride application under control? You know, what about this persisting stuff in the environment? How, I don't want to say likely is it, but what other mechanisms can we look forward to in order to potentially get some of these water bodies off the lists for chloride impairment?
Yeah, I mean, I can start first, and if you have extra to chime in. I mean, I think we're hopeful, you know, chlorides, obviously, you know, in a system like this, they will eventually flush through, you know, they'll get diluted to the extent where they at least drop below the legal threshold that we're concerned about, the threshold where they have an impact. So I feel like that was the intent of this project was, you know, if we can get salt reduction effectively in the watershed, we'll see enough of a difference where they could be delisted. I think the West Branch is already probably fairly close to that based on the data that we collected so far. But it's going to take time. It's going to take more education and more people using salt-wise practices. But I think we can hopefully get there. It's actually, I think, of many of the pollutants we're dealing with from a water quality standpoint, probably one of the easier ones to take care of.
That's the best news. Any other questions? Okay, wonderful. Thank you guys again. Thank you for coming to our Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers Convention.